Welcome to Red Talks, Uncommon Voices on Topics That Matter. The quarterly speaker series, this is our final installment of that series under the umbrella of inclusive excellence and in partnership with the Office of the Provost. Inspired and modeled off of TED Talks, certainly with our own Red Hawk gloss, what we aim to do in this series is to showcase our robust faculty talent across disciplines, to feature intersectional voices on a range of topics that bear on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So the vision is clear. The vision is to expand our reach within the local community and to advance as a thought leader on issues that matter. Today, we end this inaugural series with a student edition of Red Talks. So why does this matter? It matters because we are Seattle University in the heart of one of the most vibrant and creative cities in the world. Thus, we are perfectly situated as a laboratory for learning, anchored in our Jesuit mission and values, where we are focused on educating the whole person to professional formation and empowering leaders for a just and humane world. So what we attempt to do here is to create an environment where all of our students are free to find their voices, to hone their voices, and to use them to make a difference in the world. We are providing education in context. We do not ask our students to check their social realities at the door. The theme of this inaugural series is Women's Voices at the Intersection. What we've attempted to do this academic year is to co-create together a forum for exploring women's leadership. Today's Red Talks reflect the very essence of what it means to be a Jesuit institution. Our greatest reward as faculty, staff, and administrators is the collective work in the service of our educational mission and being able to witness together the transformative power of Jesuit education in our students. And in that spirit, I'd like to invite up our Provost, Dr. Shane Martin, who will introduce our four speakers. After, you will hear 4 Express Red Talks in succession, followed by a question and answer engagement. Thank you.
As I looked over the titles of today's Red Talks, I saw a few themes emerge that very much reflect the key elements of Jesuit education that Vice President Natasha Martin outlined. In particular, I focus on the idea that context really matters and our personal experience really matters. But it's not simply we reflect on context and experience, we bring those into a dialogical process that involves reflection and action and evaluation. And so as I look over the titles of our talks today, I actually see that incredible synthesis between personal experience and context and some deep content and reflection and structure and ideas for us. So our first speaker is Anab Noor. Anab Noor is a graduating senior studying public affairs. She works as an academic mentor at Washington Middle School as part of the Seattle University Youth Initiative. She is a student campus minister in campus ministry and is a leader in the Muslim Student Association. Anab is co-founder of the Seattle Youth Gender Justice Center, a student-run organization aimed at providing support, co-curricular programming, and resources to underrepresented students in the university. And she currently serves as the center's president. She has been recognized for leadership, including in 2008, where she was awarded the Peter Faber Integrity Award, and recently received the LaRue Leadership Award in the College of Arts and Sciences, which recognizes the graduating student who has demonstrated exceptional leadership ability, shown academic excellence, and performed significant service to the college. And notably, last week, Anab was recognized at Red Night Out as this year's recipient of the Archbishop Raymond G. Hunthausen Award for 2019. She is pursuing a career in education policy and is passionate about the issues of equity within K-12 public schools. And her talk today is entitled Culturally Responsive and Anti-Racist Education. Our second speaker will be Samantha Drennan. And I want to say that you know Samantha, of course, because of her work in the Vice President's Office for Diversity and Inclusion. When we were looking at nominating speakers for today, I nominated Samantha because in my own conversations with her, learning about her work here, I was very aware of the keen insights that she would bring. And even though she's a staff member in this office, I did not want her voice to be excluded from this conversation. And I'm delighted that this went forward and she said yes. Samantha is a graduating graduate student who is receiving their master's in nonprofit leadership. They currently serve as the co-president of the Arts and Science Graduate Council, along with being the graduate student representative on the Arts and Sciences Strategic Planning Committee. They also serve on the Center for Ethical Leadership Board as the secretary of the board. Samantha plans to continue their education and hopes to become a doctoral candidate for their PhD within the next few years. Along with furthering their education, Samantha hopes to continue pursuing life-changing work in diversity and inclusion. And Samantha's talk will be entitled, "The Structure of Diversity: Why the Institutional Structure of the Role of the Chief Diversity Officer Matters." Our third speaker will be Cheyenne Chisti. Cheyenne Chisti is a graduating International Studies and Spanish student. She has served as a Spanish conversation group leader on campus, as well as an English as a second language teacher at community organization Casa Latina. She has traveled to Guatemala to conduct research on violence against women and recently presented her thesis on this topic at the SURA conference. She currently works at an employment law firm interviewing Spanish-speaking witnesses and clients. Cheyenne is a Fulbright recipient, and after graduating, she will be completing her Fulbright English Teaching Assistantship grant in Mexico. Her experiences, both on campus and off, have motivated her to attend law school in the future. Her RED talk is entitled, "Searching for Belonging, Navigating Life as an American-Born Confused Desi." And our final speaker will be Alexis Taylor. Senior undergraduate student Alexis Taylor is scheduled to graduate June of 2019 with a bachelor's in communication and media and a double specialization in journalism and communication studies. She has dedicated her time to developing a better understanding of the role that community voices play in individuals' access to support systems as they transition to new communities. She currently sits as the Central Area Chamber of Commerce Social Media and Media Relations intern, serving the residents of Seattle's historic Central District neighborhood. She has had a long history of utilizing her talents in multimedia productions to elevate the marginalized voices of people of color, one of which being invited to CBS this morning in New York studios to pair with broadcast host Nora O'Donnell to produce her first documentary about women in the field of news and media in 2015. More recently, she has reached local news attention with her multimedia installation titled Black Among Other Things, which was originally curated for an independent study done through the university. Her process with being a self-made Black multimedia artist, as well as producing a gallery showing and navigating media outlets safely, is what inspired her Express talk. Through this process, she's learned what it means to identify your narrative and advocate for yourself. She hopes to shed light on the importance of serving others through your work and to invite everyone to uncover the truths of the world. And so I think you will join me in welcoming and recognizing 4 very distinguished speakers speaking to these critical topics in our RED Talk series.
Thank you. So when I thought about what I wanted to talk about for this RED Talk, it kind of was a no-brainer for me. A lot of my experiences in the classroom at SU and also in the community have been about education, and specifically these types of topics. And my capstone last quarter as a public affairs major was the components of culturally responsive education. And in that research, I used this definition of culturally responsive education from Geneva Gay, in which she says that it is to use the cultural experiences and perspectives of ethnically diverse students as conduits for teaching them more effectively. And that's kind of a very wordy way of saying that it is education, the root word of education, which is adduce, to bring out of young people what is already there, so that they can make a connection between their home, community, and school lives. And anti-racist education is also under that exact same umbrella, but I think important to distinguish because anti-racism is the truth, and it's telling the whole truth, holistic truths to young people so that they can understand through their education how they connect with the greater world and how the world connects with them. And so when I learned about these topics for the first time, these types of terms, was when I worked for Children's Defense Fund Freedom Schools during the summer of 2017, and these are some photos from that time. When I worked for Freedom Schools, they were in Seattle. It was a literacy program for youth of color, and I worked for them under the organization called WABLOC, Washington Building Leaders of Change. And that organization used culturally responsive practices to teach kids about literacy. We learned about how our classrooms and our lessons and our spaces could be culturally responsive, how we could have anti-racist conversations with young people, with middle schoolers specifically, and how to use restorative justice practices every day in our schools. And this experience was incredible for me and super thought-provoking, and it was also getting into some really deep theories that are really difficult to understand. So the way that I understood this after my summer so that I could utilize these resources afterwards while working with middle school students was by understanding that my supervisors told me to bring myself to work every single day, my entire self to work. And the reason is because WABLOC hires place-based leaders. That means that the people who worked at Freedom Schools that summer were all from the community that they were working with. So when you hire people who are working from the community that you are serving, and you tell these people, bring your full self every single day, then you are going to be culturally responsive, and that is what I experienced that summer. Another thing I was told was to teach the students that they can make a difference. And not that they can make a difference in the future when they're older, but like that they can make a difference right now as they are and with their own communities. And the themes of Freedom Schools was I can make a difference in myself, in my family, in my community, in my country, in my world, using hope, education, and action. So we had 6 themes over 6 weeks, 1 theme a week. And the way that we taught these young people about these themes was by reading. And every day we read a book, a culturally responsive book that was written by people of color and had people of color in situations that the students could recognize for themselves. And that is how we taught them about how they can make a difference in the world. So fast forward, and I'm a senior, and I'm doing my capstone on culturally responsive education. And I find that the #1 component of culturally responsive education is story. And that this is true among all disciplines. So math, history, reading, science, PE, whatever it is, if you want to be culturally responsive, you tell stories. And those stories are supposed to be representative of the community that you're trying to serve, so they can see themselves in it and that they can be excited about what you're talking about. So that's what we did every single day at Freedom Schools. And it was incredible. And it sounds and looks really amazing and beautiful and fun, and it was. But it was also the hardest thing I've ever done in my life to this point. And the reason is because Freedom Schools called for so much love and care. Culturally responsive and anti-racist education calls for a lot of love and a lot of care, not just from me as an educator, but from the students, to care about one another, to have these conversations. And they weren't able to get through these conversations a lot of the days because I realized, unfortunately, that they didn't love themselves. And that even if every day I told them that I cared about them, that was still very real for them, and that we had to figure out what we were going to do in order to get through our days, get through our lessons, and make the kids feel safe. So what we did was we understood that we might not get through every lesson every single day, but that wasn't really the point. The point was to make these kids feel like they were safe, and that we cared about them, and that we represented them. So something that I learned from that experience was that what I needed to do was make sure that I always held patience, which sometimes is really difficult with middle school students, but was something that I felt was the necessary skill for me to be able to tell them that I cared about them. And the luckiest days were days that we got through one book and one activity. And I think the most successful days of Freedom Schools were the times where we were able to get through in conversation with the students, with the patients that I was able to hold. And every single day, I sometimes repeated the exact same thing over and over again. And I knew that the love that I had for the young people meant that I could do that every single day, and that that was what was required of me as an educator. And in 6 weeks, we were not able to convince young people that they should love themselves or that they matter. But we were able to create spaces for them where they were excited to come to school every single day because they knew that people cared about who they were. And that was the function of Freedom Schools and what I learned about what education is and what that should always look like for young people, especially for young people of color. And I think I'll end with a quote that I saw on Instagram a few days ago from Bell Hooks. People talk about love as being really passive, as I'm gonna sit here and experience love as I am, and that will change the world. And Bell Hooks says that love is actually a lot more active than that. Love is about being transformative. So that means it's a struggle, and it's work, and it's really, really difficult. And that is the kind of love that I think we need more of in our communities, and that we need more of in our schools. And that is what I would advocate for.
Konnichiwa, watashi no namae wa Samantha desu. Hi, I'm Samantha, and this is me. I'm a gender non-conforming, queer, person of color, and a non-native English speaker. My intersecting marginalized identities are why I care so much about how diversity efforts are pushed on educational campuses and what institutions are doing to meet the ever-changing needs of a very diverse and ever-evolving student body. This is why I care about my topic for today. But why should you also care? The Center for National Education Statistics states, 41% of undergraduate students will not graduate with their degree in 6 years. A majority of those students are students of color. Additionally, of the 42% of students of color enrolled in our campuses across the United States, there are still only 26% faculty of color. The American Council on Education released a report on race and ethnicity in higher education that also stated less than 20% of leadership in higher education campuses are people of color. So how are institutions addressing this challenge? A majority of institutions within the last 10 years have started to implement a chief diversity officer. This person is in charge of leadership on issues related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Most chief diversity officers also oversee an Office of Diversity and Inclusion, which is the office that puts forth the work to move diversity initiatives forward on a campus. This is an amazing start and essential to begin the conversation of diversity on campuses. But what I wanted to examine further was how chief diversity officers were being implemented on a campus and what institutions could be doing differently to better support these offices and make sure that these initiatives were successful and sustainable long-term. The research methods I used for my project included a literature review and case studies of experiences of CDOs spanning across the United States at various sizes of institutions. I also conducted 7 semi-structured interviews with diversity professionals, including chief diversity officers, support staff for offices of diversity and inclusion, and their partners. I also used research released by the National Association for Student Personnel Administrators, the American Council on Education, and the National Association for Diversity Officers in Higher Education. There were 3 major elements that I found in my research. The first thematic element was around isolation, which was this idea that many chief diversity officers often felt very isolated in the work that they were doing, and often the systemic structure of how they were implemented on a campus actually made it more difficult for them to complete their work. The second thematic element I found was around collaboration challenges, which is this notion that chief diversity officers were experiencing a lot of challenges when trying to collaborate across dimensions of their campus, and that there were specific populations on their campus that were actually pushing back against diversity work. The third thematic element that I found was around resource strain, which is the reality that there weren't enough resources being put into the office to make the initiative sustainable long-term. The thematic element I want to focus on for today's presentation is around isolation, because it is directly correlated to how institutions set up and structure their chief diversity officer. A majority of chief diversity officers across the US fall into a collaborative officer model. This particular model does not allow for the chief diversity officer to have direct oversight over other diversity officers on their campus or reporting units. It often means they have a limited budget and a small scope of work, which often includes that they aren't a part of the implementation of diversity initiatives on the ground. My research also found that CDOs in this particular model only had a support staff, on average, 1. No matter how large the institution or student body population is. My research also showed that once a CDO is implemented on a campus, the majority of the community then begins to disengage with diversity work, because they believe it's the sole responsibility of the chief diversity officer. And in this particular model, it creates ambiguity and confusion for the community, including students, because they don't really understand what the priorities of the chief diversity officer are. So what does this mean for institutions? It means that institutions have an opportunity to build differently together. A few institutions across the United States have started to engage in a portfolio divisional CDO model. This particular model allows for the CDO to have direct collaboration with high-ranking administrators, direct supervision of other diversity officers on their campus, and direct oversight of reporting units. This particular model also builds shared investment and shared accountability about what diversity work is on a campus. And this notion of shared accountability, shared investment, this is how institutions will move the diversity needle on their campuses. In her book, Dare to Lead, Dr. Brené Brown states, if we want people to fully show up, to bring their whole selves, including their unarmored whole hearts, so that we can innovate, solve problems, and serve people, we have to be vigilant about creating a culture in which people feel safe, seen, heard, and respected. Building that culture takes each and every single person being willing to step into the arena to grapple with vulnerability, because diversity work is inherently vulnerable. And when we all choose to step into that arena and grapple with that vulnerability, we will all each individually learn how to yield our privilege like a sword and right the injustices of this world. And it is my deep, deep hope that you will all step into the arena. Thank you.
A couple of weeks ago, I was having a conversation with one of my good friends, Isabeau, and I was telling them about how I wanted to talk today about something related to Pakistan. I grew up being, or I am, Pakistani American. My parents were both born and raised in Pakistan, but I was conflicted because the genuine truth is that I don't know a lot about Pakistani culture. And sure, I grew up in a Pakistani household. I have many fond memories of eating Pakistani food almost every night and watching the occasional Pakistani soap opera with my mom. But because of the fact that I was born and raised in the United States, there are a lot of parts of Pakistani culture that I will never fully understand or even have exposure to. For example, I was never taught Urdu, which is the language that my parents grew up speaking. And this was done for a very intentional reason. My parents had heard that a lot of children who grew up speaking Urdu struggled once they started school because they didn't have a lot of exposure with English beforehand. And so as a result of that, they opted to only speak to me in English. But as a result of being the first child, and at that time being an only child, I quickly picked up on the conversations that my parents were having with one another in Urdu, and because of that exposure today, I'm able to speak and I'm able to understand Urdu relatively well. I also don't know how to read it, nor write it, and that has to do with the fact that I simply never needed to. Growing up, I was fully exposed to only English, and so that's what I was specifically focused on. Now, this is in sharp contrast to my experiences with Spanish and Mexican culture. 2 years ago, I studied abroad in Puebla, Mexico. I spent 7 months there. And as a result of that experience, along with formal study of Spanish for about 6 or 7 years, I can now read, write, speak, and understand Spanish way better than my own language, or way better than the language of my parents, which therefore connects me to where they're from, and therefore to my ancestors. When I came back from Mexico, I realized that I had never felt more lost in my entire life. I had spent those 7 months surrounded by people who were extremely proud to be Mexican, and I realized that I didn't necessarily feel the exact way about who I was in that moment. I was Pakistani and also American, but I wasn't fully either of them. And on top of that, I knew so much about a culture that wasn't even mine. And so as a result of that, I felt lonely. I grew up in Portland, which is considered to be one of the, if not the whitest city in the United States. And so I didn't know what the Pakistani experience even fully entailed. I didn't grow up with a lot of people who were Pakistani, and so I didn't know then what I know now, which is that there are a lot of people who are going through this exact same experience. In fact, there's actually a term that describes this, which is known as ABCD, American-born confused Desi. Desi being someone from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, that area of the world. Now, this term describes people who are struggling to balance the values and traditions that are taught at home, in the household, with the values and traditions, the attitudes, the practices that are most aligned with American culture or Western culture. And what I've learned now, and I can speak from experience, is that a lot of people feel like they have to choose one. Either you're Pakistani, in my case, and uphold those values daily, or you're American, and you push those values to the side, and therefore push what has been considered important through previous generations. So I was going through a search for belonging. I wanted a sense of belonging somewhere. And about a year after I came back from Mexico, I was talking to a friend that I had actually made in Mexico, and I was talking to him about how I was feeling. And he said something to me that I will never forget. He told me, "No tienes que ser parte de un país." You don't have to be a part of a country, porque tú eres tu propio país, because you are your own country. And the fact that he said this to me in Spanish only made it more powerful for me. It's important to belong and to have a sense of belonging. But there's also so much power in recognizing that you are who you are because of your experiences. And that's something that I still grapple with today. But this recognition was achieved for me through conversation, through talking about this. My conversation with my friend Isabeau, they were the one who urged me to talk about this issue today, even though I fully don't even understand what it means to be Pakistani. My friend in Mexico taught me how to feel empowered with who I am, and that what I'm feeling is completely valid. And today, I'm extremely proud to be both American and Pakistani, but like I mentioned before, it took me a while to get here. There are hundreds of thousands of people who are going through this exact experience, and they're not just Pakistani, they're Mexican Americans, Iranian Americans. There are so many people like this, and I think it's extremely important to recognize this, especially in the Pacific Northwest, where there are not a lot of people that look like me. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon. Figured today would be as good as a time as any to kind of bust some myths and kind of sort of give a response to a recent project that I just recently finished, as you guys heard. I completed an independent study with Seattle University under Rick Malleus, and it was sort of this idea. I kind of went to him, sort of a therapy session. I was like, listen, Dr. Malleus, I kind of want to sum up all the trials and tribulations that I've had thus far as a university student, and I feel like I have something to say, but I don't know how I want to say it. And he kind of looked at me like, Alexis, I don't know what you're talking about, but we'll figure it out. And so after kind of working through that, he kind of gave me a term to kind of coin what I was trying to figure out. And he said, I think you should investigate studying in autoethnography, which is a form of research where the researcher takes on this identity of research subject. So I would be researching myself through a lens of my choosing to sort of convey and uncover truths about myself. And so I said, okay, sure, I love myself, let's do it. And so here we are. Black, among other things, is an immersive sort of installation that I put together, this grand soundtrack that encapsulates sort of soundtracks and snippets of the last 4 years, and there includes sort of recordings of things both academic and non-academic, and it kind of was inspired by this era that I'm sort of fascinated with, that Black experience has got to be validated by this sort of digital recording. And so I wanted to sort of play with that, and sort of I asked myself, I said, if I could make the soundtrack to my life, what would it sound like? And I think one of the biggest issues that we face currently when we're trying to understand other narratives that aren't our own is that we don't give ourselves uninterrupted time to sort of experience them and have them. And so I created this installation and this room that people stepped into, and it was completely Black. And I think for people who knew me, people who didn't know me, for staff, for faculty, for my friends and family who kind of got to step in that and to see what the things and these intersections that I carry with myself day to day, and sort of literally hear my narrative. And so this is the promo for the event that took place on May 4th. That was an expansion of the original installation, and it was moved to a gallery in the Central District of Seattle, and it was called Our Gallery. And so this is sort of me as a child, inspired by some of my favorite mixtape covers. But anywho, me as a child, and it's got a quote that says, what does Webster say about soul? Gil Scott-Heron is one of my favorite sort of Black symbols of like what it means to really empower yourself. So I sort of played with this idea, and it was my first time showcasing this and my first time really being able to come out as an artist and sort of make something where I had time to, and kind of really give people this screenshot of who I was. And so people came on that Saturday, and we had some 100 folks, for those of you who were there. I know there were some faces. And it was such an impactful thing, and people either came out crying or sweating or telling me, like, Alexis, that I don't even know what I just experienced, but I thank you for it. And I think people were able to, at one point, just sit down and have this sort of conversation that didn't necessarily ask you to respond, but really just sit with the art and sort of sit with what you were hearing and actually hear the narrative for the first time. And so it was as bigger than I could have asked for it to be. And now looking back, I was, moving forward thinking like, I don't know where to move next. And I had so many people reaching out to me saying like, okay, let's move this. This needs to have a bigger audience. We want to put it somewhere else in Seattle. And I was all for it at first. I was super excited to have opportunities and people who want to give me resources to sort of promote this narrative that I have, which was very much my own and very intrinsically me. And the only thing was that a couple days after our big sort of debut, I somehow got leaked to the local media through ways that I hadn't asked. And there is a portion of my piece that runs about 14 and a half minutes long, and it sort of features local Seattle Times journalist, and maybe you've heard of this, Nicole Broder, who's been working with the Seattle Times for almost 25 years now. And about a year ago, I sat down with her in a class setting, asking to do a journalist profile. And so she and I met up at Stumptown Coffee right here on 12th, and this is my first time meeting her, and I was kind of, sort of interested in hearing about her, ironically, because I had heard a lot of hot topics about her as a journalist, and so I was kind of excited to investigate for myself. And sitting down, for those of you maybe you have seen some of the news stories, or maybe you hadn't, within like the first 3 minutes of our conversation, we click record and we're recording for our interview, and I ask her like, tell me a little bit about yourself, and she reaches over and grabs my hair and she says, oh my God, so is the green woven in it? At the time I had green braids, and I was frozen. and I didn't know what to say or where to move forward, and I sort of took a moment to reflect, not because this was the first white woman to ever reach and ask me about my hair, no, it wasn't, but I took a moment to think about the power distance and how this professional, who I had sought out from a professional setting, had come across and violated my personhood before asking, or even, and thinking about how this sort of silenced all the people that she's maybe ever had the opportunity to speak with. And so, for me, I took a moment of silence for the people of color that have perhaps been susceptible to, having her come and try to investigate their stories. And I thought about all the narratives that we've lost because people like myself who didn't want to continue with the interview after the first 3 minutes, were sort of just put in this place where we didn't feel, or we were confined to sort of the structures of the power distance that we had. And so, unpacking that, I included that because I wanted to give an example in, like many of the examples that were in the piece, of what it really means to sort of live with these microaggressions for the people who've never seen them. And you hear it, and most people came out, with chills because maybe they had never had something like that happen to them and they had never been violated in that way. But that was just one of so many dense topics that are covered within the Black experience within the piece. And so with that being said, naturally, I expected that would garner a lot of attention given her status and whatnot. But when the news had reached out to me, they had asked about, oh my God, we just got a tip about your piece. We'd love to come experience. And so, of course, as an aspiring journalist, I invited them in. I said, anyone who would like to hear the narrative, I invite you to. And so I had a couple different publications come out, and we had an additional showing just for them and sort of a Q&A so that we could make sure that we got to the bottom of the narrative and made sure that we were able to sort of make sure that what I wanted to get out of the piece and what I wanted people to experience was kind of highlighted if it was going to be published. And I had a really unfortunate and really unsettling sort of experience. And so these are just a couple examples of some of the headlines that made feature paper about my piece. And if you'll notice, a lot of them include things like Seattle U artist evokes the pain and joy of being a Black and female, or Black, among other things, installation reflects on racial insensitivity of local journalists. And when I saw these and when I was exposed to the media in this way, I immediately thought about how unprotected these people had put me in the situation they'd put me. A lot of them focused on this lens of Nicole Broder as if that was the holistic sort of point of my piece. And it hurt me to know that I had sat for hours and hours with these people at this publishing or this showing saying like, yes, that is an integral part of this sort of idea, but other than that, it was just an example of a microaggression. And she was not going to be, I didn't want to be reduced to the situation between Nicole Broder and I wanted to make sure that I was viewed as a whole person rather than just, this lens to sort of out the Seattle Times or out Nicole Broder. And so it was really disappointing in a lot of ways. While some of these people would argue they're really well written, I experienced a lot of flashback and a lot of hate and a lot of sort of ugliness, just being put in the media in this light and thinking that this was some sort of witch hunt, which it definitely wasn't. And so, also being an upcoming graduating senior, dealing with, trying to wrap up school and also trying to make sure that, that I can have a safe space to create art. And then for this to sort of be the final sort of encapsulated view that the city got to see was kind of disheartening for me. And it made me want to understand that in the future, moving forward, I would always advocate that no matter what you do and who you are, that you seek your narrative and that you make sure that you advocate for that. I think especially people of color have it especially difficult because it takes so much for you to be able to bring yourself to the table and to be able to be in a space to create art or create whatever is cathartic for you to have a nice form of self-expression. And so this was sort of just some of the little snapshots, and you're welcome to read any of these if you'd like. And if they're great synopsises for what they are. But I do think that sort of the ways that media puts especially Black women in danger and allows them to be susceptible to these kinds of critiques and feedback is something that we should be very careful of, especially when it takes so much for someone to be able to bring their narrative forward. And so, if anything, I would leave you with this quote, which is, stand firm in your identity and remember no one knows the story you carry quite like you. And so no matter what the news probably said about my piece or what they thought was the most important part of it, it was a whole piece, just like my identity is a whole identity, and it's not one thing, it's not one microaggression, and it's not going to be reduced to anything other than what it is. And so I appreciate you guys allowing me to have the time to share that with you all.